More than 70% of the most documented serial killers in history shared one thing: a childhood no one should have had. Specific mistakes made by specific people. That turned specific children into monsters. So the question is, what exactly did they do wrong? Here's the uncomfortable part. Most serial killers weren't born evil. Psychologists, criminologists, the FBI, they've spent decades going back through case files, court testimonies, prison interviews. And what they keep finding is the same thing: a pattern. Abuse, neglect, humiliation, abandonment, sometimes all four at once. That doesn't mean every kid who had a bad childhood becomes a killer, obviously. But when you line up the most notorious serial killers in history and look at what happened before the murders, the overlap is impossible to ignore. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy grew up believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. When he finally learned the truth as a teenager, the identity he'd built collapsed. His grandfather was reportedly a violent, domineering man who beat the dogs, swung cats by their tails, and terrorized the household. Bundy later described him as the only male role model he had. He never processed the deception. He never processed the rage. And he turned both of those into something the world would never forget: Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's parents had one of the most publicly bitter divorces in Milwaukee. They fought constantly. Both checked out emotionally long before they officially separated, and when they finally left, they each assumed the other was taking Jeffrey. He was 18. He came home one day to an empty house. No note, no call, just gone. He was already disturbed, but that abandonment, that complete indifference, pushed him over an edge he'd been standing near for years. His first murder happened weeks later. Ed Gein. Ed Gein's mother, Augusta, was almost pathologically controlling. She raised him and his brother in complete rural isolation, told them women were instruments of the devil, and read them passages from the Old Testament about death and murder as bedtime stories. She was the only person Ed was ever close to. When she died in 1945, he boarded up her room and kept it exactly as she'd left it. He started grave robbing shortly after. He wanted her back so badly, he literally tried to rebuild her. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy's father was a drunk who called him a sissy, beat his mother in front of him, and told him repeatedly he'd never amount to anything. Gacy spent his entire life trying to prove him wrong obsessively. Community work, business success, performing as a clown at children's hospitals. He built the perfect image of a good man. Underneath it was a boiling hatred. He turned on young men who reminded him of his own powerlessness. His father died, never knowing what his son had become. Gacy said that was his only real regret. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez had an older cousin named Mike, a decorated Vietnam vet who came back broken. Mike showed a teenage Ramirez crime scene photos from the war. He showed him how to stalk and hunt. He killed his own wife in front of Ramirez when Richard was just 13. Instead of being horrified, Ramirez was fascinated. His parents didn't know. His father, when he did find out about Richard's behavior, responded with beatings. The violence wasn't stopped. It was just redirected. Ramirez later said Mike was the only person who ever really understood him. Aileen Wuornos. Wuornos never met her father. He was in prison. Her mother abandoned her and her brother when Aileen was 4. Her grandparents took them in, but her grandfather was physically abusive. She was pregnant at 14, allegedly by a neighbor. The baby was put up for adoption. She was thrown out of the house at 15 and was living in the woods, turning tricks to survive. Before she was old enough to drive, she'd never experienced a single protective adult in her life. Not one. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas's mother, Viola, was a prostitute who made him watch her work. She dressed him in girls' clothes for school, beat him with broom handles, and once hit him hard enough to cause a brain injury that went untreated for days. His older brother was so afraid of her, he ran away. His father, a double amputee she'd also brutalized, drank himself to death. Lucas killed Viola when he was 23. It was the first murder he ever confessed to, and the one he seemed least conflicted about. Albert Fish. Fish was placed in an orphanage at age 5 after his father died. At that orphanage, he witnessed and received regular beatings. He later told psychiatrists that he discovered he enjoyed the pain. That was the institution's solution to raising children in the 1890s. Punishment. By the time he left, he'd developed a taste for things no child should ever have been exposed to. He called his childhood the making of me. He meant it as a boast. Dennis Rader. Rader's case is one of the most studied because he seemed, on the surface, so normal. Researchers who interviewed him post-arrest found he had a profoundly authoritarian upbringing, rigid, cold, emotionally withholding, no space for vulnerability, no modeling of empathy. He developed what psychologists described as a complete split between his public self and his inner world. He was a church president, a compliance officer, a husband and father, and for 30 years he hid an entirely parallel life because he'd learned from childhood that you bury what's real and you perform what's expected. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman's mother, Vera, was the center of his world, and she was dying of cancer. He watched district nurses come to the house and administer morphine injections that gave her relief in her final hours. She died when he was 17. He became a doctor. He gave hundreds of his patients morphine injections. The official inquiry found he killed at least 215 people, possibly 260. Almost all of them elderly women. Psychologists who studied his case concluded that what he was recreating over and over was that moment, the control, the calm, the power over death that he'd first witnessed at his mother's bedside. Ian Brady. Brady was illegitimate, and his mother gave him away to another family shortly after birth. He grew up knowing he was unwanted. His foster family were decent enough people, but Brady became increasingly isolated and obsessed with Nazi ideology as a teenager, not because anyone exposed him to it, but because he went looking for a framework that explained why some people had value and others didn't. He needed that framework because he'd spent his whole life being told implicitly that he didn't. He found it, and he used it. Myra Hindley. Hindley had a grandmother who favored her, and a mother who largely didn't. After a childhood friend drowned in a pond when she was 15, an event she felt responsible for, she withdrew socially and became deeply susceptible to influence. Brady found that susceptibility and cultivated it methodically. Criminologists have debated for decades how much of Hindley was shaped by Brady versus her own childhood. But the consensus is clear. She came to him already fractured. He just handed her the hammer. Charles Manson. Manson's mother, Kathleen, was 16 when she had him and showed almost no interest in raising him. She was in and out of prison for robbery. For a period, she literally tried to trade him for a pitcher of beer at a bar. The bartender refused. Manson spent years in reform schools and youth detention centers where the abuse was institutional. By the time he was released from prison at 32, he'd spent more than half his life in institutions. He told the parole board he didn't want to leave. He didn't know how to exist without structure, so he created his own. Robert Hansen. Hansen grew up with a father who ran a strict bakery and held his son to impossibly high standards. Robert had severe acne as a teenager, was painfully shy, and had a bad stutter. He was relentlessly mocked and rejected by girls throughout high school. His father showed him no warmth, no reassurance. He internalized that humiliation and never let it go. As an adult, he became a skilled hunter in the Alaskan wilderness. He started hunting women the same way, releasing them in the backcountry and tracking them. The psychologists who interviewed him said the murders were the revenge he'd been constructing since adolescence. Peter Curtin. Curtin grew up in a one-room apartment with 12 siblings and an alcoholic father. At around age 9, he befriended the local dog catcher, a man who taught him how to torture animals, and eventually, he was receiving what some researchers call apprenticeship in violence before he was 10 years old. He later said that watching the family's suffering as a child was when he first learned that power felt good. Carl Panzram. Panzram was sent to a reform school at age 11 for petty theft. What happened there was not reform. Staff beat boys with leather straps and used humiliation as routine discipline. Panzram came out of that institution with, by his own written account, a hatred of the whole human race. He wrote one of the most disturbing autobiographies ever produced by a convicted killer, not because it glorified his crimes, but because he methodically connected every act of violence he committed to specific things that were done to him. He didn't expect sympathy. He just wanted it on the record. Tsutomu Miyazaki. Miyazaki was born with deformed hands. His wrists were fused directly to his hands. He was bullied mercilessly throughout school and retreated into a world of anime, manga, and horror films. His parents showed little emotional engagement. His grandfather, the one person he felt close to, died when Miyazaki was in his early 20s. He later told investigators he consumed his grandfather's ashes because he didn't want to lose him. His first murder came months later. Researchers who studied his case concluded he had no capacity to distinguish distinguish between fantasy and reality, a capacity that had never been developed because no one in his life had ever helped him build it. Nanny Doss. Doss grew up on an Alabama farm under a controlling father who refused to let her socialize, go to school properly, or have any independence. She developed an obsession with romance magazines. Idealized love was the only kind she could access. When the men in her life repeatedly failed to match that ideal, she poisoned them. 4 husbands, 2 children, her mother, a sister. She smiled through her confession and told investigators she was just looking for the perfect mate. The tragedy isn't that she snapped, it's that she never had any tools to process reality differently. No one ever gave them to her. If this was worth your time, a like takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. And if you want more content like this, where we go past the headlines and into the actual why, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.